Hello everybody, thank you for joining us for today's video. We're going to excuse Josh today, and because he's not here, we're going to break our routine and our cycle and do something a little different.
We
Today,
can do anything we want now.
yes, and not stress Josh out that we broke our streak. So today we're going to talk about something that we see a lot, especially when we get new clients, or I don't know about you, but I feel like sometimes clients wait a couple sessions to tell me stuff like this.
Yeah, I think so.
But specifically, like, what happens if you tell your therapist that you're doing something that's illegal, which is maybe a broad way of putting it, but I don't know. I feel like this is something, like I said, that people maybe don't always disclose right when they show up, but that comes out eventually because they feel like they need to talk about it, but they're maybe feeling the water first.
Right. See how much they can trust you before
Yeah.
they bring up these kinds of things.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So how do you respond? What do you do when someone tells you you're doing something illegal? I know it's kind of vague, but
It is kind of vague, and maybe before we say that, what kinds of illegal things are people doing that they tell us about, right? One of them that I would say that I hear relatively frequently is shoplifting.
Mhm.
That's one that I hear. What other kinds
Sure.
of illegal things do you hear about?
That's a good question. I don't know. I think definitely certain drugs I hear a lot, and I think we're going to talk about that in a separate video. But the only other one that really comes to my mind is when I have underage people viewing pornography.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I would say underage people viewing pornography is one that we hear. I would also say that one thing that I hear is underage use of substances.
Oh,
right?
sure,
So
yeah.
people under 21 using certain
Yeah.
things they're not supposed to be. And sometimes that involves stealing too, right? Not
Yeah.
always, but sometimes it does. We also sometimes have people tell us about different fraudulent things that they're doing money wise, right? And whether that's their job or their own personal life. I think that those are things that we hear about too. So
Yeah. I maybe we edit this out if it's too much, but I have heard before, also people soliciting sex workers and stuff, which is maybe gray in some states, but illegal in many.
right, and illegal in this state.
Yes,
Right?
yeah.
Yeah. So if somebody comes in and tells you that they're doing something illegal, what are some of the things that you would say?
Usually, it depends on what it is, right? Because there are certain things that we are legally obligated to report and other things that we're not. So I don't know. I try to give a disclaimer, and I've had people ask me hey, if I tell you about this thing, will you tell somebody? And I'd be honest with them. I say, yeah, if we talk about this, and it looks like this, I will have to report it.
Right.
Maintaining that trust and helping them know, maybe what they should and shouldn't say if they don't want to get things reported. But yeah, I think it really depends on the subject. But I think, like with many of these things, it's usually I'm less concerned with what they're doing and more of why do they feel the need to do this or commit this crime or whatever it is.
Right. Well, and I would say the same thing, right? I, as a therapist, I don't know that I feel really super judgmental about any of these things, but I do think that it's helpful to try to help people understand, well, why are you doing this? How is this benefiting you versus how is it not?
Yeah.
Right?
And I think that's the most important part, what you said, is it's the hope is that you can come tell your therapist and it's not going to be a judgmental situation and that it's a place where you can discuss these kind of behaviors and what you want to do with them and how you feel about them, and not a place where you're going to come say something to your therapist and they're going to be gross.
I think people worry about that a lot. They're
Yeah.
going to disclose that they do something illegal like this, and that it's gonna be the worst thing we've heard or something. And I can just about guarantee it's not gonna be the worst thing we've heard.
Sure. Yeah. I feel pretty confident in that as well.
Yeah. Some of the things that I think might be helpful for people to know is that where is this line? What are we gonna turn around and report or tell somebody about versus what are we gonna keep between us, and we're just gonna kind of talk about how this affects your life. And I would say that it's probably helpful to know that substance abuse is not something that's reportable, even if you're underage. So I mean, if you're a teenager, like your therapist is most likely not going to go straight to your parents and be like, so guess what?
Yeah.
Right? Like that's not something that therapists have to report. Sometimes parents really don't like that fact,
Yeah.
right? Sometimes parents really, really don't like that maybe their therapist might know that their child is doing some kind of substances and then not,
And not
telling
telling
the
them.
parent.
Yeah. Sorry, parents, but not really.
Sorry, parents, but really, like, if we were to come to you with some of those things, your child or teen would straight up never talk to us again, and it would be not really very helpful for them to be in therapy at all. Whatever time that we had spent building a relationship with them wouldn't be useful, right?
Yeah, and I think that's kind of the balance you're always playing as a therapist is what do I tell, what do I not, but how do I most importantly like do what's going to be the most beneficial for the client. And I think in 99% of cases, if like a teenager says to me they're smoking weed or vaping or whatever, I don't find it beneficial to involve the parents, right? It's more important that I maintain that therapeutic relationship with the client so that they can have lots of benefit rather than lose the relationship over being like, nope, I got to tell your mom.
Right. Because as much as parents and myself as a parent would like to be able to say that I can control all of these things for my kids or my teenagers, like it's just not not accurate. It would be better for the teen to sit and talk this through with a therapist and figure out like what's working for them, what's not, what are some of the consequences of this, and help them come to their own conclusion about it, as opposed to us telling them what the conclusion is and giving them a punishment. Because usually that only creates this situation where teens just start hiding things.
Yeah.
Then they hide it from their therapist and their parents, and then I don't know how that's helpful.
No, then you're
for
in big
anybody.
trouble. Yeah. So I guess maybe it'd be helpful for people watching to talk about what kind of things do get reported. What kind of things do you have to report as a therapist?
Yeah. A lot of people have asked me if I have to report stealing, because sometimes people may even come in and tell me they have a plan to steal something, right? And actually, I'm not required to report any of those kinds of things. If somebody has a plan to go steal something and they tell me about it, I'm for sure going to try to talk to them through, like, what are the benefits and consequences of that kind of behavior, but I don't have to report something like that. On the other hand, as a therapist, it is our job to report things if they have like a big safety concern attached to them, right? So I'm probably not gonna report any kind of substance use that's going on for a teenager. But if the teenager is using substances in a way that I'm like really concerned that they're going to die as a result, or they're trying to, or like not preventing themselves from overdosing, right? Like they're kind of walking that line of like, well, maybe I die, maybe I don't. That might be a space where we would have to say we've got to make some kind of plan to make you safe. We might have to talk to a parent in a situation like that if there's an immediate risk to safety.
Yeah. And same for, again, I think if you're listening to this and you're wondering about it, right, safety is always kind of the underlying principle of what gets reported and what doesn't. If you tell me you're going to go home and beat up your neighbor because you're so mad at him, right, there's a safety risk. Obviously, we'll try and talk through the whys and the whats and all of those things. But any threat to harm yourself or harm anyone else is where we draw that line of, okay, this needs to be reported outside of here to somebody else. We need to make a plan.
Right. Some kind of plan. And maybe that would include like a parents or a spouse or a loved one, or maybe there are times where it might include something like law enforcement or child protective services, right? Because we do have to report those things where people are not likely to be safe. Child abuse, neglect, those are things that we always have to report.
Yeah.
And actually, I don't know if most people know this, it's not our job to do any of the investigation as to like, am I 100% sure this is happening? If I have strong suspicions that something like this is happening, it's my job to report it.
Yeah.
So, if you disclose something like that, your therapist is probably going to ask you additional questions, because child abuse and neglect are those things that fit within the we have to report category.
Yeah. And I think where it gets a little bit tricky is some of these things like harming yourself or somebody else or child abuse are pretty universal things we have to report. But some of the other parts are specific to your state that you're in.
Yeah.
Like I know, for example, Utah doesn't have a policy to report domestic violence. There's actually nowhere to report domestic violence, whereas other states, like for example, I know California does have that's one of the things they are required to report is domestic violence, and there's a specific hotline for it and things like that. So I think some of these things do vary a little bit depending on what state you're in.
Yeah, yeah, for sure. One of the things that I think a lot of people don't know that we have to report, and teens get caught off guard by this one sometimes, right? If a teen or somebody underage is sending or receiving what would be any kind of pornographic images, right, of somebody that is underage, that is considered child pornography.
Mm-hmm.
And that's something that as therapists we have to report, right? We have
Yeah.
to report that to a law enforcement agency. And this is one that I think catches people off guard a lot because I think that this happens a
Mm-hmm.
lot, but sending or receiving those images is considered something that is illegal and has to be reported.
Yeah. Yeah, and again, it's like the safety thing, right? Because earlier I mentioned like underage people viewing pornography, and if someone told me they were viewing like online pornography, I might not report that, right? But if once I know, oh, this is some kind of exchange of underage pictures or something like that, it totally changes it just because of that.
Right, right, because you can't send or receive
Yeah.
images of somebody who is underage in any of those kinds of situations.
Yeah.
So,
That's one I saw a lot at when I worked for CPS. We dealt with a lot of those cases.
right.
And like you said, I think it catches teens off guard a lot that it's as big of a deal.
As it is.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think so too. Are there any suggestions that you have for people that if they had something illegal they were doing and they wondered if they should talk to their therapist or what was going to happen, how should they approach that with their
Yeah.
therapist? What would you give as far as advice?
I always think being honest with your therapist is your best policy. And I can't speak for every therapist, I guess, which is the hard part of this. But I always appreciate it when my clients maybe frame it, like I mentioned earlier. I've had people, a teenager in my office before talk about, hey, if I did this thing, would you tell my parents? And I can say yes or no to that. And they haven't disclosed anything to me, which maybe feels like we're skirting the line here. Like,
Right.
but I think it's a safe way to maybe test the water, and hopefully your therapist is understanding enough to say, hey, look, like, they're trying to trust me with something.
Mm-hmm.
And if I'm going to report it and they don't want me to and they don't tell me, that's okay, right? They trusted me enough to even suggest it. Does that make sense?
Absolutely. And I would say the same thing, right? I would say if somebody wants to tell their therapist something and they're not sure if their therapist is going to report it, it would be okay to start out from a hypothetical situation, right? Hey, hypothetically, if I was going to tell you about illegal substance use, right? What would you do? Would you tell my parents? Would you call the cops?
Yeah.
Like, I want to know what that would look like. Because technically you haven't disclosed
No,
anything,
nothing.
right?
There's nothing to
Technically,
report.
There's nothing to report.
Yeah.
Technically you're just asking a question, but it can give you a good way to sort of read into whatever your therapist's response is going to be. And any therapist that is a decent therapist is going to be honest with you about like, well, here's what will happen if you disclose something like that, right?
Yeah. I like to think that therapists don't like to report people and report these things.
Right.
I know personally it's very not my favorite part of this job.
No, I hate it.
And so I appreciate if someone can be open and honest with me, even if it has to be in hypotheticals, to get to a point where I don't have to report because I don't want to, and I also don't want to get you in any trouble. So
Right.
it's a win-win as far as I'm concerned. But then it becomes something that maybe we can discuss hypothetically.
Right. And I have had sort of longer conversations with people that are hypothetical.
Mm-hmm.
And it is kind of like walking that
Mhm.
line as a therapist as to like how ethical is this.
Sure.
But I think that for most of us as therapists, we want to err on the side of helping people.
Yeah.
And if you have certain things that you're doing and you're trying to keep them to yourself and deal with them without ever talking about them in therapy, it's really hard for us to know how to help with that. Right?
Yeah. And I think that's kind of maybe the part that gets misunderstood about reporting things is the things that do get reported, and that when I had reported things in the past, has always been because I thought it would be the most helpful, right? Like if I was worried about one of my clients' safety, maybe they don't like that I did it and I reported, and they didn't think it was very helpful. But as a professional, I felt like this is what that client needed, and so I like how you said that, like erring on the side of helpfulness, and some of the reporting really does fall under that, and it is because of people's safety and what's truly helpful for them.
Yeah. To give people a little bit clearer idea of what this might look like in session, I had a client come in and say to me, if I report this to you, what are you going to do? And I said to them, well, if you've reported something like that to me, then I actually will have to make a phone call to Child Protective Services, and the phone call will look like this. Here's what I would say. And you could do that in session with me, or I could do it when you leave, whichever way that you would prefer. But that's what would have to happen. And in this particular session that I'm thinking of, the client was really not happy about the idea that I would have to report that. But I was very clear with them that if we talked about that, if they told me that that happened, I would have to report it. And the client ultimately decided to tell me the information, and we did report it, and the client was initially not very happy with me. But I would say, like, trust doesn't mean that people only do what you want them to do. Trust means that people are clear with you about
they're going to do exactly what
happen.
they say they're going to do.
Right. And so this client and I worked through that situation. We were able to continue to work together because ultimately they knew that I would tell them up front what it was that I was going to do so that they knew what to expect. I tried to fill in as much as I could of, this is what this will look like if you tell me. And I would say that for anybody, if you have a therapist that's a decent therapist, they need to be able to do that for you. Mm-hmm. They need to be able to give you a clear, here is what you can expect. And so I think that clients don't so much need to worry about walking into a situation and being blindsided. They just need to ask more questions up front.
Yeah. And maybe as like a whole separate tangent we can talk about another time, but as far as like disclosing any illegal activity, or whether it's hypothetical or whether you're being straight up, whatever it is, the most beneficial case for your best case scenario is that you can be honest with your therapist, and like you said, your therapist will be honest with you in return, and that'd be a sign you have a good therapist and you have a good therapeutic relationship, even if maybe this client was not super happy that you did what you said you would do.
Right. So, I mean, maybe just to end, I would just say it's really important if you're doing something illegal, don't think that you just have to hide it and not talk about it. And also don't just necessarily go in and blurt it all out either. It's fair to ask your therapist, what will happen if I say this to you, mm-hmm. so that you have a good awareness of what's coming next.
Yeah, I like that. Well, hopefully that answered some questions if you guys had any about telling your therapist about illegal activity. Don't leave it in the comments. I can't promise anything will happen there. So if you liked our video, please like and subscribe. We'd love to chat with you guys, and we'll see you on the next one.
Thanks.